it is definitely having an impact and more exposure to the work I'm doing. That's a really valid point, what people will look for, right? I hadn't considered that point. The biggest takeaway for me is the audio versus visual.
Welcome to this new episode of my podcast debut, where I interview people like Cecilia who are thinking of starting their podcast or in the process, and hopefully it gives you the inspiration, the motivation, and the knowledge to get started with your own podcast or YouTube channel. Cecilia, thank you for being here. My first question to you is, it's your first podcast today. How do you feel?
First of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate that you take me on for this podcast episode. I feel a mixture of excited and also a bit nervous, to be honest, because it's something I've never done. And so I do feel like I'm leaning into my edge, doing something completely new. Yeah.
Thank you, Cecilia. Yeah, that's very common actually. That mix of excitement, nervousness, and excitement. Actually, nervousness can be a sign that we're doing something that makes us grow. So it's a good sign. Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to get straight into it. What is your podcast idea?
So it's a podcast that speaks about the things in motherhood and postpartum that aren't so commonly spoken about. So we always have this idea that when you become mother, everything is great and it's fantastic, and we show to the outside world that we are this like happy, fulfilled mother, and it feels quite hard sometimes to really honestly and vulnerably share what you experience, because there's a fear of it being met with criticism or with, yeah, I think mainly with criticism by people who might not understand you. And so you immediately feel like, oh, if I'm not happy and fulfilled, everything's perfect, I'm a bad mother. Or people might not think I'm doing my job correctly. And so the intention behind this is just to bring forth and talk about topics that, from my experience with my own motherhood and also with mothers I've worked with and people I know who are mothers, are very, very common topics, but are not spoken about so much publicly. To give mothers the feeling that, hey, we're in this together and you're heard and understood, and that there's just this like space to bring these topics, to the world so that they can be seen as what they are, a normal part and a sign that things need some shifting around the way that we deal with pregnancy, birth, postpartum, motherhood topics. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think that's very important. We need more authenticity. It's beautiful to have people who want to bring that authenticity online, especially with social media. People tend to show the highlights and the best. And it's similar in, for example, the coaching industry. Sometimes as a coach, I'm like, everyone's putting only the good thing and what works well. And I know the people personally. I know myself. It can be a little bit different. And I'm not a parent, but I imagine for motherhood, people tend to always put the best, which is beautiful. But yeah, I love that you want to bring that authenticity. I think it's super important. So thank you for sharing this. Thank you for wanting to do that, and congratulations on taking that step to creating this. Yeah, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the practicalities. So, how often do you want to post? And do you do video, audio? Do you want to have guests or just solo?
So, sorry. In the beginning, it's just audio for sure. I feel like that's something that just makes sense for me to get started. It's also easier for me because I have a small son myself to just like from a practical perspective to get into it. And in the beginning, it's only going to be me, but I would love to get other people on, whether it's mothers or other people working in the field at a later point, because I feel that these conversations are very valuable. So just to get started, I think it makes it's easiest for me to just do this alone, to find my own rhythm and structure, and find my flow with it, also because I have my family, and then later on to expand it, to make it bigger, to make them maybe longer, because they're going to be quite short. Because the intention is also like mothers often don't have that much time. So how much can I give that they can actually receive? And if it's an audio and it's like 15, 20 minutes, there's space when you drive, when you have a few minutes. And so I do want to tailor to also like the audience, right? And it is targeted mainly to mothers, but also to other people who want to learn more about it. So yeah, audio and not so long to start with. I think that answers the
Beautiful.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good to understand your audience and then to tailor to that audience, right? Because whether it's, sometimes people ask, oh, what platform, audio, video, how long, and ultimately it depends a lot on the audience. So in general, I tend to lay more on the side of doing video for exposure, for clips. But if you really feel your audience is more on the audio, then potentially you don't really need to do that video if you feel they're not really hanging on YouTube, for example, or want to watch clips as much. But I'd love to ask you also, because the strategy of the podcast depends on the audience to adapt to that, but also on the goals that we have. So I'd love to ask you, what are your goals with the podcast?
So it's a number of things. One of them is that I want to give mothers, well, it's on a very personal perspective. I feel like it's really important for mothers, and specifically women generally speaking, to feel like they're in their own authority. So when they make choices in terms of their pregnancy, their birth, their motherhood, that they're the ones who are making those decisions, which also flows into the purpose aspect of it. And I do think that sometimes just hearing other people's stories can already allow you to receive that more and to understand more that I am the one making decisions. So one part of it is to reach people or mothers in a way that they actually get to really anchor in that truth a bit more. The other part of it, it is definitely having an impact and more exposure to the work I'm doing, because I think it's important that if you have an important message that gets shared with the world. And I feel that specifically, like you were also saying, with social media things, we create a very specific image, right, of what we want people to see. For me at the moment, it feels like if I do this via audio as well, that it takes out a little bit of this like visual creation of doing a reel, doing this, and that gives a very specific image, and that it allows me to be a little bit more, maybe less curated. Because when I talk, I begin and then I just kind of flow and I go with it. And I want to bring in that element of this is me right here in the moment, talking about these topics. It is not organized, it is not curated, it is just what comes through. And it is really me and like really what I want to share in this moment. So I feel like it brings in, it has a different impact when it's just true to the moment rather than something I've curated differently. So I'm hoping that this format of talking and sharing will impact people in a different way than I could maybe do by creating visuals.
Mm.
Yeah, so I'd love, like, impact would be one. I would love to expand my like have a bigger impact, reach more people with it, and then obviously also bring my message across, and what I want for the women and the people who listen to it to actually receive from the work I do.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this. Also, I want to say, for a first podcast, you speak in a way that's very calm and grounded and clear. So that's, I think you can do really well with the podcast. You seem to be very at ease already with the podcast and speaking. So that's really cool. And for your first interview. And by the way, on this, a little message for the viewer. If you also want to come on the podcast and talk about your podcast idea, even if it's just an idea and you're not sure, or also if you're already in the process of launching, you come and speak about it. Even if you haven't done a podcast before, that will be the opportunity to do your first one here. So you'll see a link in the description, and you can just hit me up and we can organize this podcast. If you want to start a podcast and you're still shy to be on camera, we can also have a discussion in private. And Cecilia, also going back to your goals, do you have also specific goals? It could be a certain number of clients or leads that you want for your business, or a certain number of views.
So it is part of so basically this is going to function as my lead magnet for the online container I'm doing. So I'm going to, the podcast series is a way of getting people in that they will later then hear about my other offers. So it comes with a subscription. You subscribe with your email address, and then you can listen to the podcast, and then whatever I offer later, that's it. So I think it's important to mention that it's also there to convert people, of course, to then later look into my actual offers. Um, yeah, but I also like I said, it's this, and then it's also obviously creating value for the people. And yes, I would love to get in a certain amount of people, but I haven't thought about numbers in that sense. Since I'm right at the beginning with this, for me, I don't even I can't even understand or comprehend really how well I can reach people with this and in what ways because it's so new. So even how to say that, how I would, where I would show it and how I would share it with people, all of these topics are still really new for me. So I'm really in the stage of creating it right now. And then the second step for me would be is like, okay, now I have it. Now how do I make it public? How do I reach people with it? So the whole reach art part of things is something I still feel a bit insecure around because I just don't really know how to do it, if I'm very honest. I'm not sure that
Yeah,
answers the
thank you.
question, but it's still
Yeah,
vague.
it does. It does. Thank you. So yeah, it's hard for you, yeah, to put these numbers, but let's imagine we're 6 months from now. So you're launching your. When do you want to launch the podcast?
As soon as I'm done. So I'm gonna record it soon. So within the next
Is it
month.
like okay within the next month? So let's imagine. Let's say you launch within the next month, and then we're 6 months from now. What would success look like
In terms of reach,
in terms of your podcast in general?
um, well, positive feedback that people actually feel like it has an impact, that they can relate to it, that I found a good way of distributing it so people actually know how to access it and how to find it. That people come back with responses so that I feel that it's actually creating something. So I'd love to feel from people who listen to it that's having an impact, that they've listened to it, that it's doing something with them, to feel that I'm actually creating something of value. Um, and in terms of numbers, I mean, if I could get maybe in 6 months 1,000 people to listen to it, that would feel really good. Even though I have no idea if that's a lot or not, but it's just like out of my, just like a number that feels like I would feel like I've done a good job at distributing it for me.
Thank you. Yeah, that seems achievable, and also yeah, views are good, and then there can be different strategies if you want more views, or maybe it could be some could be okay less or listens in this case. Some could be less listens and but more targeted, right? So, for example, you can have 10,000 views from like I don't know entertaining things that people click on, or then you can have 1,000 views from people who are really going deep into what you share and potential client for your business. So I think 1,000, if it's like the right people and people who really want to follow your journey, I think it's good. And if you do audio anyway, in general in audio it's a little bit so the bad news, let's say, it's a bit hard to get discovered and to get the exposure that you'd have, for example, if you do video on YouTube, where you can get a lot of exposure from people who don't know you. But then it can be also lower quality, where people click the more clickbaity thing. It's a little bit more social media in that vibe, where when you do audio only, usually people who come, it's usually less people, but then it's people who are kind of true fans and subscribe to your podcast. Like I know myself, I'm subscribed to hundreds of YouTube channels, some that I've forgotten about. Well, usually podcasting, I'm a little bit more selective, and I have a few that I listen to more.
Can I ask, would it make sense to do both, as in record it over a visual app and then you just extract the audio and then you have two versions? Would that make sense, or would you say that gets just very confusing for people?
So to record video and extract the audio.
Yeah, for example, say you have, like we're doing it now using Riverside, and then I have a visual that I could upload onto YouTube, on social media, but then I also have just the audio from that recording and then distribute that also separately. Or does that get confusing for people because it would be like two different channels?
Mm. No, it's not. It's not confusing, because so you could do what I do with my other podcast, The Light Leaders. I prioritize YouTube. I post on YouTube the video. If it's online, I use Riverside like this. And then I use Spotify for creators, and I upload the video there, and it's connected to the podcasting platform. So, for example, on iTunes, it will send only the audio automatically. So, actually, on Spotify, which is Now, I mean, YouTube is becoming the biggest podcasting platform, even. But then on things where people listen more audio, it would be Spotify is bigger than iTunes now. But Spotify prefers video too. They will recommend your podcast more if you do video. They also rebranded from Spotify for podcasters to Spotify for creators because they understood that the way YouTube is doing it with smart recommendations is actually working much better. So they really prioritize video. So if you're open to it, I would definitely encourage you to do video, post on YouTube, and then post on Spotify for creators when the audio can be sent to the other platforms automatically. What I usually recommend is to be clear on what's the priority. Is it more an audio podcast or a video podcast? And so, for example, you could think, okay, it's funny because with the Light Leaders, I thought it was an audio podcast. I thought I'm on video, but most people will just listen to it. And at some point, I had just so many more views on YouTube that I was like, okay, it is a video podcast. And some people on YouTube also will just have it in the background. I have premium, I listen to it, just like I do with podcasts. But you kind of need the video though to get the traction and to be recommended there. So yeah, I'd recommend to do that actually. How does that land?
Yeah, it's opening up a lot of different like thought processes, right? Because in my head before I was like, oh, I'll do an audio because I just felt like it's easier for mothers or like people who I'm targeting specifically to access because you can do it on the go. But then it's the same what I do when I take courses or I listen to something and it's a video file. I will just listen to it when I can watch it, right? So I do the same. So I'm thinking that it might be helpful in terms of what you mentioned earlier, that you can also post clips on social media and other platforms where they actually get to have you have this other extra exposure that is not linked to you maybe creating a poster or something with a link, but you can actually see part of it, a bit like Instagram Live, right, in a sense. And so yeah, it does feel good. It feels like something I'll definitely look into and see if like I mean I'm not sure how I'll feel in front of a camera that way because it feels in my mind it feels easier to be like, oh, I'll record it and it's just the audio versus doing it with a camera. But maybe it's actually easier for me. Because one thing I noticed that for me the easiest way to record or to talk about things is when I'm talking to someone. So just like we're in conversation, it's easier for me than if I'm talking to nobody and I'm just recording it. And so that's something I've been thinking about anyway, is maybe there's a way for me to share this information by having actually somebody I'm talking to, because I just feel like in conversation things flow better. And then again, that would make more sense in terms of a video podcast, right? If I have another person on the screen. And so maybe I'm actually moving away from only audio to video with people in the interview. Kind of failed. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's changing things in the way I'm approaching it for sure.
Amazing. Yeah. I love what you share also about talking with someone because, well, first on the audio versus video for you and for the people watching, I have on this channel a 10-minute video about audio versus video. But the bottom line is, yeah, videos adds a bit of complexity, but really helps for discovery and for sharing on social media also. So you can fill into that and then I would say in general, I recommend video unless there's like a really strong case for audio, whether it's for the audience, for your goals, or if really some people really don't feel comfortable being filmed. So if it's going to delay the whole thing, might as well start with audio. I did my first podcast with audio and then I went on video. Um, and then I really like what you share also about talking to someone. So that's the other part, which is often people like solo or with guests or a mix. And so solo logistically is obviously much easier. If you're good at it, you can just press record, speak, and you have an amazing podcast. But in reality, a lot of people that I coach find that it's really challenging. I think a lot of people in general find it really challenging to speak to a camera. It's much easier to be in the mind versus having a conversation like this, which is much more natural for a human being to have a conversation. So logistically, one is easier, but in terms of being comfortable having a conversation, it can be actually easier with guests. I've even done with one of my clients, she really froze from doing a solo episode, which I usually recommend to introduce your podcast. So we ended up having me asking her the question that anyway she wanted to answer on the solo, but just because I asked her, it was flowing versus her doing it alone in front of a camera.
Yeah, no, I relate.
Mm. And you can
Yeah, it's
the
interesting.
beauty of podcasting is you can also it's good to think about how you want to do, but then you can also adjust. It's actually quite good to know your audience, much easier to reach people. So it's good that you know that already. You already have that niche, your business aligned with it. So that's super strong foundation. You're comfortable. It's a really good foundation too. And then the format can change a bit. Like people will enjoy. You don't have to do only with guests or only solos. Like people will enjoy that. Sometimes you have a guest and sometimes you have a solo. And then after a few episodes, you might realize, oh, I really like doing this, or this is not working at all, and adjust as you go. Because podcast is very lean in that way that you can do something for the first 5 episodes and then change. It's good to have some consistency, of course, but it's not too rigid. It's not like a book where you can't really change the topic or the style after 5 chapters. Here you can.
Yeah. Have you, sorry, I'm asking questions now. I know it's you
Please.
asking me questions, but have you worked with Substack in terms of podcasting? 'Cause I know that they have this whole new thing that you can now upload videos and do podcasts. I mean, it started as just a writing platform, and now they're expanding that. You have a whole subscription thing. I'm curious if you've had any experience with that.
Yeah, I don't. There might be people that find that is great for some reason. I haven't played with it. And I would say in the world of podcasting, there are a lot of things that, in my opinion, are very unnecessary in the world of today and that can be add a lot of complexities, overwhelm, and paralysis. And one of them is the platform thing. So you bring Substack. Some people talk about like Buzzsprout and different platforms where you can put your podcast. I think in 2025, it's a little bit different than when iTunes was big and it was about being a top charted podcast, especially if you play the YouTube game. It's more an algorithm game. So it's not about knowing this trick or that trick. It's more about doing really good content that people want and packaging it well, of course, for the platform. So for me, in terms of podcasting, the best strategy, which is the one I'm doing, I believe, is prioritizing YouTube because, for example, a lot of moms are going to search some of the things you talk about on YouTube. Uh, I don't know exactly what topic you will come into, but if it's like, I don't know, how to um, I don't know, how to support my child with his homework, whatever. I don't know if it's something you do, but people will type that on YouTube and look for it. They won't really type that on iTunes or on Spotify. So then you're on YouTube, and that's super easy. It's free, and then you use Spotify for creators. It's also free and pretty easy. And then you connect that to iTunes. Should be enough. And that's it. That's where you have your podcast. Then people can watch or listen, and it's easy. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, all good. No, don't be
That,
sorry.
that was my podcast coming in there.
Yeah, special guest on the episode today. That's
Yeah,
so good.
but
Well,
if he's
let's.
in once, he's not anymore. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, that's all good. That's all good. Yeah. Do you have
And
any other questions?
that's a really valid point. What people will look for, right? I hadn't considered that point. I have a very like practical question. I think that's maybe my big it's probably a big hang up for many people, but I don't actually know how I would introduce when I begin the podcast. So noticing that I'm having a really hard time um, even think about how do I start speaking. So once I speak, I feel comfortable with having like recording for a longer period of time. But I've noticed that um, I don't know, do I do an introduction episode where I just talk about what I will talk about? Do I just begin straight with an episode that has a specific topic? How do I introduce the podcast? So I feel quite unsure around like the very practical steps of talking in the beginning, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah.
That's
And are
probably
you
more
referring
common.
to how to start each episode or how to start your podcast overall?
I guess both, right? So the first question is, does it make sense, like you mentioned it before, to have like an introductory episode where you just kind of
Mm,
share, this is the name of the podcast, that's what I'm talking about, this is who's blah blah blah, So there's a bit of a like intro, or would you say it doesn't make sense, you go straight into the topics, and then if I do, then how do I do it? Do I just briefly introduce the name? Like, how would that come together so that it's coherent, but you don't go on
yeah.
describing things for really long?
Yeah. So my answer to that is both. So the launch I recommend, and the one I do is usually with my clients. There can be exceptions, but it's launch with 2 episodes, and one is an intro to the podcast, and another one is a typical podcast. And the idea of that is when you launch, even though I say every episode is a launch, the first launch is still a great opportunity to get people who already know you, trust you, like you, to get on board and subscribe. So without overthinking it too much, I like to use a little bit that launch energy. And as part of it, when you do those two, the introduction is for people who already want to follow you, then they have an introduction to the podcast and have a framework you can follow and also improve and customize for that, which is then people are like, okay, I'm interested in what she does. That's what she's starting. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And now they're like, okay, great. That's what I want to subscribe. But then you launch also with an example. So if you were to do solo, it could be you on a topic, which is an example of what you do in the podcast. If you were to do more with guests, it could be an interview with a guest, for example. And then people who then they can already go to episode 2 and be like, okay, that's a typical example, and they go deeper. But then it can work the other way also, where let's imagine you have a guest for episode 2, then if someone follows that guest and they're like, oh, I listen to that person I follow on a podcast and they're like curious about your podcast, then they can listen to episode 1 after to understand what it's about and subscribe. So the two work together. So that's what I recommend for launching your podcast.
So basically launching them together, right? Just to,
Yeah. Then you launch the two. And some
okay, cool.
people will start with the first one and go to the second one. Some people will go the other way around.
And given like, I mean, I want to make a short podcast because I think it just like, it's what makes sense for my target group. Would you recommend still doing like one and then the next so you space it out? Or would you say it's fine if it's, I don't know, like 15-minute long, like episodes to launch like 2 or 3 at the same time? And then just kind of like bundle them up because they're not very long? Or do you say it makes sense to always just do one and then you kind of space it out in between?
Yeah, I mean, a typical thing that works well is launch with two and then once a week, for example, is usually a good way to start. So
Cool.
you launch with
Thank
two.
you.
So from the beginning, there's at least two. Like you
Mm.
could launch with three, but I think two is enough. And then every week, one. And then if you have more capacity, if you like it, you can do more. But I think that's a good start. How does that land?
That lands very well. I feel a lot clearer now than I did before I talk. And I really wanted to have this conversation with you before I really dive into recording it. I've done some tests just for myself, but I really want to like speak to somebody first, speak to you first, because I felt like it would really help me ground and just get more clarity and also more confidence when it's actually something I'm speaking to somebody who knows what they're talking about, because I don't, not in terms of podcasting things, right? So yeah, I feel like it opened up a lot of different avenues I can explore in terms of how do I want to do it, but also gave you more clarity and confidence in it. So yeah, it feels good.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm very happy to hear that, Chichi. And do you feel like, so it's good to hear. And do you feel that there's anything that feels quite challenging ahead of you now that you need support with?
I mean, I think for now the most important thing for me is just to start and try it out and see what happens when I record, because my hardest thing is always to start, and then I feel like I might have a hard time then actually um publishing it, launching it, and like trying to make it available for people. That's my general two biggest challenges are starting something, and then when it's finished, to then actually make it public. These two things are challenging for me. Being in a process of doing something creative is quite easy, which maybe is the fact that I'm an artist, that I just like, I feel good creating, but then showing it to the world in one form for me is quite difficult. I feel for me at the moment, the most important thing is to get started. And then when I'm done, to see how do I feel about launching it and how do I work with that then? Because I tend to overthink
Mm.
things. So I can
Okay.
imagine that at the point when I'm ready to launch, that yes, then I might need some support with things. But where I'm right now, I think to just push myself a bit and take every minute I have to actually just get it out there and like finished. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it
That's what
does.
I
It
feel.
does. Yeah, it does. Yeah, I'd love to ask you also as we're going towards the end of this episode, was this valuable?
Yeah, very, very valuable. I would definitely recommend people to come and talk to you if they have even just that, just thinking about doing a podcast without an idea or anything. I feel like you have a really very clear but also firm way of guiding people and answering the questions. And I feel less nervous and more excited now than I did in the beginning, which feels like a really
Amazing.
good
Awesome.
approach. So I can see that I feel different at the end. So yeah, very much.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, you shared already a few, but what would be your main takeaways from our conversation today?
Um, I think one of the biggest things is the fact that I know nothing about the podcasting world at all in terms of any of the avenues and opportunities I have within it, how to do it. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is the audio versus visual in the sense of why you would do visual and how you can link the things. So just like understanding that it can be so overly complicated and that you can make it quite simple, but that there's definitely a lot of value to doing things the way that people have different access to it that's more visible. Because I mean, I know it is what people like to see people, right? And so
Mm,
just understanding this difference is very, very valuable for me. And just seeing that there's more opportunities and more things than I could think about. And then the other thing is also that felt really valuable is how you described the launching strategy with the intro and the second episode and why you would do it that way. And the last thing for the three is coming back to myself, the reflection that I feel more comfortable talking with somebody else than doing it by myself.